Thanks, John. Thanks very much. I think we will get a chance to, hopefully, you can fold in the remaining part of what you wanted to say now during this period. Okay, how do we do this? My goodness, there's lots of you out there. And why don't we start by because likely there have been questions provoked or stimulated by the excellent presentation. So why don't we start by entertaining two or three of those? Yeah, I'll come to you in half a second, and then I think we should take John up in his offer because I know many of you in this room have been doing things in this regard, and come and tell us a little bit about your examples, and maybe throw a couple of questions to the panel as well. But let's start with some clarifying questions or the like. So, sir, start with you. And there are microphones going around. Yeah. Okay, Laura's got one right behind you.
Hello. First of all, thank you for sharing your expertise and knowledge. I was specifically wondering, based on your knowledge and your expertise, so for Mike, for example, and also for Grant here, why specifically the people, like the statistics in Denmark, why the people there are unhappy, what were the specific reasons, like say your top three or whatever, and compared to, for example, here in Vancouver, why the people here are what are the specific reasons for why they are unhappy. And so, and don't get me wrong, I'd like to know why people are happy too, but obviously knowing why people are unhappy, it gives us means to move forward and do something about it. So yeah, there you go. Both for both of you guys. Yeah.
Well, in terms of the results that we had by CMA, as I mentioned, so the intent here was to document the range of satisfaction responses across the CMAs with the depths of the sample, take into account the individual level characteristics, as I mentioned. Beyond that, the question of what accounts for these differences across CMAs remains the open question. Now, John in previous work and others have pointed to issues around belonging. There's both economic, material, and probably more likely these social factors. This is a research agenda that's before us at this point.
Okay. Interesting. Mike?
This is on. Good. Of course, those two things are linked, the happiness and the unhappiness. I think what is the most interesting to look at in these studies is the panel studies where you follow people over time. So what we did in Dragør was a one-time study. We will repeat it in 2 to 3 years. The good things about doing repeating studies is that you can see how life circumstances, changes in those affect happiness. Because otherwise we have the cause and effect issue. Married people are on average happier, but is it because we get happy from marriage, or is it the other way around, that happy people have an easier time attracting a partner? So when you look at things over time, and they've done that in Germany and England, followed 10,000 people over 10 years, what they can see there is one of the biggest drops on average in happiness is when people lose their jobs. And income,
Sense of purpose.
yes, sense of purpose, of course, loss of income, but also loss of identity. It's the first question you ask often other people, so what do you do? And of course the social connections we have at our office.
So purpose and community.
Yes.
Yep.
Thank you for summing it up. Yes.
Are you able to get? So do we have two microphones or only one? Because I've just been, I sort of acknowledged folks over here. I tell you what, let's batch them then. Comments and questions here, back there, and then come on over here. And then we'll turn it to the panel, okay?
Hi. Just wondering if any of the studies you've done factor in intelligence and sort of philosophical enlightenment into the happiness factor. Because it seems to me from my own limited research, people who have a higher sense of intelligence or a sense of life and things around them tend to be unhappier.
All right. So,
I'm just wondering, and of course, if you go through a traumatic experience, how that there's recent studies have come out that your DNA gets imprinted with post-traumatic stress disorder, and it gets passed on to like generations, and like children of Holocaust victims have these unhappiness issues and trauma that they don't know where it comes from, even though their lifestyle might not be as traumatic, for example. I don't know.
Okay,
Just
great. So
curious.
let's batch a couple of these. So Laura, the woman in front of, yeah, right here. Yes,
Thanks.
and then the woman back
Just
there.
to echo that, I was curious, listening especially to Stats Canada, how aspirations or expectations factor in. It's kind of the keeping up with the Joneses, and of course the media plays into all of this in terms of what we hear about. In Vancouver, it's largely housing prices and affordability, so it can be a self-perpetuating cycle, I think, sometimes as well, versus focusing on other things that connect and build a purpose in those sorts of things. Thanks.
Thank you. Laura, let's get the woman at the back there. And I hope you beg my forgiveness. We'll come back to you, and we'll get Laura to come around there for the next batch of questions. Okay.
Thank you. My name is Lindsay, and I work at the David Suzuki Foundation as the Queen of Green. And I was really happy that you mentioned generosity as a factor of, it has a lot to do with a campaign we're launching tomorrow, which is a mental health campaign called 30 by 30, where we ask Canadians to get into nature for 30 minutes for 30 days. And I was wondering if any of the panelists can comment on directions of research you might be going, or if you have looked into nature connectedness and people understanding that connection with how it affects their happiness. We've done 4 years of research from Trent University, a psychologist there, that's looked at our data when people spend 30 minutes for 30 days in nature, and they have better sleep. They spend twice as much time in nature by the end of the program than they did at the beginning, and less time in front of the screen. And we know that other pieces of research show that it makes people more generous. Spending time in nature reduces crime rates. And I wanted to comment on your community garden idea. I'm not sure if you're aware of the research that just working in the soil, there's microbes that actually, make your brain release serotonin in your brain, which is another great one too. But I didn't realize the other comment about thinking of the seasonal effect of when people are more likely to be depressed. So thank you.
Okay, so let's get some reaction from the panel related to the questions or statements around intelligence, philosophically enlightened, aspirations, including things like costs of living or cost of housing, and the wild nature in all her glory, and that connection with social well-being. So 3 nice, juicy questions. John, why don't we start with you?
The idea about intelligence and unhappiness, the most long-standing historical link on that is Durkheim, who invented sociology, but he also did his marvelous book on suicide before the start of the 20th century. And he found universally, with 1 or 2 exceptions I don't have time to go through, people with more education were more likely to commit suicide. Similarly, in our happiness modeling, although there's a positive correlation between education and subjective well-being, if you hold everything else, ignore everything else, once you put in income, and which of course is higher the higher your level of education, and social trust, which is, for reasons we don't yet understand, heavily supported by the degree of education, then the effect of education turns negative. Durkheim's interpretation was people with too much intelligence spent too much time inventing problems they can't solve. And on the greenery side, we don't have much stuff on the other part of your, at least my research doesn't have anything much on the second part of your question, but on the greenery one, there's a lot of research like the stuff you're doing almost everywhere, that a greener, quieter city with people spaces set out. When I was preparing for this, one of my specific ideas was, why do we stop? It's always good to stop arguing about something and having something positive to do with. Why don't we stop arguing about the Arbutus corridor and just make it the beautiful long trail of green for bikes and pedestrians that it could be? I mean, you think about the popularity and social importance of those tiny bits of elevated railway in Paris and London, and in Paris and New York, that have changed those cities. And here we've got the Arbutus Corridor, which is 10 times as long and 3 times as green. It could be a life-changing feature for Vancouver, and something to people from the various parties could work together and build rather than fight over. One more environmental point, if I may. Catch the next interurban. On the environmental side, it occurs to me that a lot of what we're talking about here, about aspirations and so on, is about social norms, really. You're happy when you have social norms, and obviously if the social norms are pro-social, then everybody wins, but the social norms are enormously powerful. Now, if there's going to be a change in how one generation thinks of the interests of another, one country thinks about the interests of another, it's going to be converting these historically limited sets of social identities, which have started at the family and the tribe and extended and now go to the nation state, but seldom beyond. But the power of humanity is they were able to create larger groups whose sense of us included, and it seems to be the next innovation that will save the planet is changing that to a more inclusive social norm that includes future generations and everybody in the world, and then you've in fact made, as it were, their problem our problem, and much easier to get solutions, and that will beat any pattern of effects you would get from any set of regulations and taxes on energy use.
Thanks, John. Grant and Mike, you want to take a crack at this?
Just picking up on the intelligence comments, John made the point regarding education. I guess just coming back, and I know it wasn't the nature of your question, but one of the advantages of using the large group data across CMAs and so on is that because when we compare life satisfaction or happiness across individuals, there's always the question about, well, what's the unobserved characteristics, what we're not observing, issues like you're talking about. When we compare across large groups and large samples across these cities, unless one wants to venture out that there's systematic differences across cities along the characteristics that you're talking about, that those things get netted out. And so then we could talk about the other factors. And that doesn't diminish what you're talking about, but it does, I think, testify. I think those factors do get netted out in the cross-CMA comparisons that we're talking about. On the social comparison, a couple of points. Looking at a recent OECD study that was summarizing the literature, the issue of housing came up, and they made the point that there's a vast literature on life satisfaction and happiness that's growing in leaps and bounds. The issue of housing costs, relative proportions of personal income spent on housing, and the extent to which that may be impacting upon life satisfaction for different groups in the population, and particularly youth in large urban centers, I think is a worthwhile area, and I think we could go there with the data that we have on that topic now. Again, something to be explored. And again, the issue of absolute versus relative income and the issues of social comparisons that one makes. On the issue of connectedness, really brings up the sense of when one evaluates communities, livable communities, there's a long history and a long tradition of looking at the objective conditions within a city, the quality of services, natural beauty, green space, and all of these things. And I think there was always an assumption that if you had those things, that it would automatically translate into subjective well-being of the individual. And of course, social connectedness and these other factors is not part of that literature. But from my reading of that, what you do see is certainly that the green space issue does translate across.
Mike.
What's to add? I agree with points from John and Grant. I think what we could add is with regard to the social comparison element. We know, as Grant mentioned, that we care not only about absolute income, but relative income. We look at how much do our neighbors make compared to ourselves. And I think today we have an additional challenge when it comes to social comparison, because we have better ways of doing those comparisons due to social media. I don't know about you guys, but when I open Facebook and whatnot, I get a constant bombardment of great news that is happening to everybody else. So my friends are getting married, they're going to Hawaii, they're getting A's on their PhDs and so on. And I always open Facebook when I come home and there's leftovers and I need to clean and I need to do my washing. So I think that unfortunately makes us evaluate our lives poorer than we actually should. Because if we're constantly bombarded with great news for everybody else, we think that's how their lives look, and that's not really the case. So I think unfortunately we are better equipped, or equipped with the wrong weapon for making those social comparisons. And I think that's unfortunate.
There's a positive footnote on that social comparisons are made more and more negatively with income and material consumptions than they are for the social aspects of life. So in fact, there's sort of positive spillovers from happiness and social connections in a way, positive social connections in a way there aren't. So it's one more way in which people spend too much time thinking about the material for their well-being and too little thinking about the social connections.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thanks for that. I hope you don't mind that we'll batch it. We'll do the same here. So come down just a little bit, Laura, to right there. Okay, and then the gentleman beside her, and then the gentleman over here, and then let's batch those and see how those blend together. We've already got a nice blend of the social and the ecological, so.
Well, I'm moving in different direction because I do believe that happiness is personal choice. It is not related to economic circumstances or any other circumstances. It's the way we want to live. So obviously it doesn't lead itself to very interesting research if we stop correlating and comparing ourselves all the time, but it could actually bring more happiness, genuine happiness to people. So I'm touching on this more of a spiritual issue. Have you considered looking at it? Happiness being personal choice, not circumstantial.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Yeah. Please.
In self-report surveys of this nature, very often social desirability accounts for a huge chunk of the variance. 30 to 50% is not unusual. Can you tell us how you handle that contaminant to your data?
Okay. And the gentleman over here. And was there anybody else around here?
On a slightly different track, I'd like to make an observation and then a question. So, having recently moved from downtown Toronto to Vancouver Island, and given the season we're in, I couldn't help but notice in the Stats Canada list of surveys, the cities with the highest happiness ratings do not have a professional sports team. So I was wondering if anyone's doing any research on the correlation between community happiness and the prowess of their professional sports teams.
Great. Okay, let's take one more over there. I actually thought it had to do with winter, but.
Hi, my name is Alicia, and I would like to hear your comments about urban form and happiness, and specifically the design of cities and the buildings in which we live and work and how they affect our happiness.
Okay, all right. So thank you for indulging that combination. Let's stop there for now. Sarah or Laura, we've got a couple down here, and then I want to encourage some of the folks from the City of Vancouver and their Healthy City Strategy to say a few words. Victor from the Dalai Lama Center, folks from Can You Dig It, Spectrum, Plan, etc., to come forward and share a little bit of your story. But okay, let's get the panel's response. Now, Mike, am I going to put you on the spot if you start first? And
no, but I think there were some questions our Canadian experts should take care of. But I would like to answer, or try to answer the last question about the urban design, because I think that is a field that has tremendous potential. Of course, we know and have looked at for decades, how do we design cities for people instead of, for example, for cars, which have been done many places in the US. Great things are being done now. One of the places is the University of Rotterdam, where they have looked at individually in Rotterdam how different infrastructures correlates with happiness or satisfaction with the given neighborhood. So one of the findings were that, how much does cycle infrastructure, how much does playgrounds, how much does churches and mosques correlate with satisfaction in the given neighborhood. What they found was that actually mosques and churches and religious institutions were one of the biggest correlates. One of the factors was there's a large ethnic Muslim community in Rotterdam, but also importantly, what those institutions do is they bring the local community together, and that links back to what we're talking about today. But I think for planners, for urban policymakers, there's a huge insight potential there to figure out how do we plan and build and design better cities.
And the first question was, I'm going to not do it justice, was around spirituality, personal choice, and the like. Do you have a comment on that?
When it comes to spirituality and religion, I think that has been debated over some time with some different conclusions on that one. As far as I'm oriented about the subject, is that early on there was concluded a link between being religious and happiness. Later on, it has been contested whether it's the religious element or whether it's the fact that if you're religious, once a week join some sort of congregation and meet your local community. So you might as well join the local tennis club or volleyball team or someone. And that brings us back to the whole social relations issue.
Thank you. And by the way, feel free to comment on any of the Canadian questions, because our definition of Canada, according to Peter Zowski, is as Canadian as possible under the circumstances. So you've been officially deputized. Grant or John, do you have comments on those, the 3 or 4 different sets of questions?
Let me tackle the happiness as choice and not context. Earlier this year, we released a study on the life satisfaction of recent immigrants in Canada. And what we did is we used similar data that what we presented here, but we also matched that up with data from the World Values Survey. And what we specifically did is we identified from the World Values Survey the country of origins from which recent immigrants that we had in our other sample had come from. And so from the World Values Survey, we said, what's the average level of life satisfaction in India, in China, Pakistan, wherever these folks were coming from, Romania, and so on. And we had that from the World Value Survey. I actually have the slide, but we won't spend time sorting around for that. And then with immigrants in Canada for 10 years or less, so they had not been here for very long, and we had the life satisfaction question here. And we also controlled for 6 or 8 other factors in terms of income and where they were living, their health status, their age, their marital status, and so on. And basically what we found was that from the countries of origin, we have life satisfaction on this 11-point scale that were often in the range of 4, 5, or 6 out of 10. But the recent immigrants in Canada generally had a life satisfaction score that was around 8. They looked very much like Canadians. And if we went back and said, where would they have been in their home country if they had had their life satisfaction that they indicated on the Canadian survey, often they would have been in the 90th or the 100th percentile. So I guess the conclusion I draw from that was that context mattered, and it mattered a lot in terms of their life evaluations. In terms of the social desirability, I'm not convinced by that. I think that that people are able to answer this question, that 1 in 7 people are willing to answer it as 6 or less. Is it the case that there's many far unhappier people than are willing to self-identify on the question? I'm not convinced by that, but can I offer solid evidence to say that that's not the case? I would look to John for support on that, but I don't have a response on that.
I share Grant's view about the social desirability. There are a lot of ways of cutting into it where the ability to impose that is less on the individual, and they give consistent results. On the personal choices, I've got a slightly different take. I think there is a lot left to personal choices and how value-driven and what values there are differ. But one of the chapters in the new World Happiness Report is on the neuroscience of happiness. And some of the experiments that Richie Davidson is reporting in that chapter are that people can take training to actually improve their generosity and empathy and a variety of pro-social behaviors. And through training as little as 2 weeks, they end up not only changing their behavior, but changing the underlying neural patterns in a way that lasts. So that does suggest, because you have to agree to take the course if you like, and you're not going to do everything on your own. And the feature of what we're telling you here collectively is almost everything is better done with cooperation and collaboration, not just personal choice by me, but genuine choices that involve ideally people more than yourself. But the argument that you can actually change your underlying, what's called a personality, in a way that improves your life and others, I think is building up very fast.
So thank you. Now, panel, would you mind if I have an idea here. We don't have a lot of time, but it'd be really nice to hear like a smattering of folks who have been addressing this challenge for a number of years, certainly from my estimation, a couple of decades worth of very interesting work in looking at how to nurture happiness, belonging, and address social isolation in our city. So I'm going to mention, I've mentioned some of them already, but there's also folks here from the Collingwood Neighborhood House, from the Vancouver Foundation. But Carol Ann, do you want to say something from the point of view of the city of Vancouver and its what I think is pretty glorious healthy city strategy? And then what I'll do is I think maybe 2 or 3 minutes each, and then I'll just move around a little bit. Victor, I'll come to you next, and then we'll throw it back to the panel if we may. So Laura, can you get over to Carol Ann, or Carol Ann, can you? And the folks that connect Vancouver, Can You Dig It project, Plan, Spectrum, many more. Okay, Carol Ann.
Hi. So the Healthy City Strategy is a strategy that was passed by council last fall, and it's a social sustainability framework along with the economic and ecological framework for the city to move forward and do its planning over the next 25 years. I just want to acknowledge Ali Grant, who was one of our key architects on that project. And the framework has essentially 13 goals. It's an integrated, multi-sectoral, upstream strategy that looks at a good start, things like a good start, housing, a home for everyone, making ends meet, and cultivating connections, which is very in keeping with some of the discussions we're having here. And in the framework, there are 21 targets and 43 indicators. And some of the indicators are things like every person has 4 people in their network. And so one of the next steps on this strategy is really starting to develop an action plan. And as part of the action plan, we're really focusing on one of the primary areas, which is social connections, inclusion, and belonging. We had an engagement strategy in preparing the framework, and I think that probably the thing we heard the most from every session we had from the majority of participants was around feeling connected and social connectedness, neighborliness, feeling included. So we're going to be going to council in June with an action plan. We just this week had a collective impact table on inclusion and belonging, and really interesting to bring parties that we would typically not have had conversations with to look at how we might be doing some collaborations in a different way. Second.
So Carol Ann's a senior social planner at City of Vancouver and one of the major leads on this initiative. Where's Ali Grant? Are you here? I know you're here. There you are. Okay. All right. Doing some work with Healthy Cities now. Do you want to talk about that?
Just to mention that I would be interested if the panel, or a bit later on even Al as well, could speak to what you think of the relative usefulness of happiness as a particular framing compared to, say, health or green or any of those things. We know, of course, that, the happy city is also the healthy city, the greener city, etc. And so when we're thinking about how to work with some of the institutions that can really make a difference in making better cities for more people, then I'd be interested to hear from you in terms of strategically the relative usefulness of those framings.
Okay, thanks, Ali. Victor, down here, Victor Chan from the Dalai Lama Center.
Well, I have a bone to pick with John here, who's been a good friend for many years, but still, I'm going to do it. But before that, let's say, take the point that John said about riding an elevator and trying to make another person in the same elevator miserable by talking to him or her. I think that is one way to do that, but I think that in terms of scale, it's something that is psychologically rather difficult to do, and we all have barriers to do something like this on a consistent basis. Now, I look around me in Vancouver, and there are thousands and thousands of condos with many, many floors and many, many people living in these tall buildings. Now, what if there is some kind of concerted effort, like in my building, I live in a condo, and there's a manager in there. And this manager, all he does is really to make sure that the whole place is spick and span, clean. Now, what if this manager also have a parallel role, which is to be a social animator, someone who instigates things in the condo where you have 500 people living in the building, and you put in a coffee machine, for example, and you have regular get-together so that people on the same floor get to meet people on the same floor. So I don't know whether this is happening in Copenhagen and other places, but Vancouver is blessed with thousands and thousands of these tall buildings. So if each of these tall buildings has a social animator, that will mean a lot of social capital being developed. But this is not the bone that I'm picking with John. The full disclosure is that I'm a groupie of the world's most important happiness guru, the Dalai Lama. Now, he's been talking about happiness for all of 80, well, he's 80 years old now, so he's been talking about happiness for like 6 decades of his life. And before him, there's a guy in India 2,500 years ago who talked about happiness also. And one fundamental insight of this guy in India 2,500 years ago was equating happiness or correlating happiness with generosity. Now you guys are finding out that, if you're generous now, you'll be a happier person. But this insight has been around for a long time. So at the risk of sounding pompous, I would say that the kind of research on happiness, we are scratching the surface. The kind of thing that you're doing or measuring is a bit at the tip of the iceberg. Research have shown, for example, that in the last few decades, our real income has been increasing. The curve is going up. But the sense of well-being, the sense of happiness of people have actually gone down. And the other point about that is that, let's say if you have a catastrophic event in your life, let's say that you lose a limb because of a car accident, your happiness go down dramatically. But after a while, it goes back to your set point. What that lady was saying over there, that happiness is basically a internal thing, that substantive happiness and durable happiness is something that at the end of the day does not or should not depend on external circumstances. So a lot of things that we do to try to increase our sense of well-being, at the end of the day, we are talking about something that we are increasing our pleasure quotient, perhaps, something that is akin to a small degree of being hedonistic.
So
And
Victor,
if you want something that is more substantial,
we're running
then
out of time.
right, sorry. Then I think digging deeper would be of interest.
Okay, so I'm just mindful of the clock here, but I saw there was a hand. Was there a hand over there? No, Aaron, not for you. Vicky, one last comment over here, and then we'll throw it. Let's grab a couple more then. Okay, let's pass it along to this woman here, and then to Vicky, and then back to the panel. And please be generous with your use of the time. Speaking of generosity.
Hi, my name is Amelia, and I'm a career counselor, and I just wanted to give you an idea. You said you wanted to bring some ideas back home. We had an organization funded by Brock Tully, and he introduced random acts of kindness. And what he used to do is he used to organize people together to initiate random acts of kindness in which you would do something and pay it forward. And then that person would also take that idea, for example, paying a parking meter and pay it forward. And that actually relates to what this gentleman was saying, is generosity equals happiness. So if we were able to introduce an initiative where we have random acts of kindness in the community, I think it would increase our happiness here and abroad.
Thank you. Vicky?
Hi. My work's been about addressing isolation for some of the most marginalized people in our communities. And what we've discovered, both using in-person connectors, a little bit like Victor was talking about, whose work it is to build the networks of connection, and using online technology, is that a real key is about being intentional. And one of the things I get a little bit concerned about when there's lots of discussion, certainly about our public spaces and green and all of that, which I think is really, really critical, I also think that there is a dimension of intentionally creating a network. And maybe this is part of where the question about, our choice to be happy, but it's also about our choices to be connected. And this is particularly relevant as my generation is aging. And it seems to me for us to have a happy old age, all of us are going to need a connected network. So I'd like, if there's an opportunity for any reflections on that. And my other, just in terms of some of our own work, one of our findings around creating these connected networks around people is the degree that their confidence changes. So their confidence, and whether that's part of the trust that you referred to, Dr. Hellowell, or other parts, but I was wondering if that showed up in any of the work that you're doing related to happiness.
Okay, our time has gone by far too quickly, but Grant, why don't you lead off, and then we'll go to John, and then we'll let our guest from Denmark
Well, I'll let John respond to his nemesis in the second row on that. I guess the concluding comment that I would like to make and to put back to the audience is that for students, master's students, doctoral students who are here in the audience, that if you're looking for a thesis topic, I would encourage you to get out here. And we have this wealth of data that I've highlighted. That's been my main objective to underscore that. And it's available in the research data centers within the universities here in BC, and both the General Social Survey as well as the Canadian Community Health Survey. There's a public use microdata file that's also made available, and that's free of charge. So I would certainly like to see these data be used more extensively and additional contributions to the discussion and the research in this area.
Thanks, Grant. John?
I like the random acts of kindness notion, and the notion of intentionality is also important. Nothing but agreement there. And I keep agreeing with Victor. So he said he was against what I was saying, and I say I agree with Victor. So there's a problem here, Victor. The idea, of course, I misspoke myself seriously by saying this was a recent finding about generosity. It's only in the empirical literature that's a recent finding. It was not in the earlier empirical literature. It's been in the longer literature, philosophically and then religious mode. After all, the golden rule is either number 1 or number 2 instruction in every religion there has ever been, and the golden rule is essentially an invocation about generosity. What we're finding in experimental work is a twist on that. That although generosity makes you happy, it makes you happier than you think it will. And there's a good reason in philosophy why that should be, because if you knew it was going to make you happy, then you could accuse yourself of doing it in order to make yourself happy, which would be selfish, and you'd... That's all.
Mike.
I'm going to steal the random acts of kindness idea, and Victor's, should we call it Chief Social Events Officer in the buildings? And just following on what John said about the recent findings, what I find useful now, and of course it's frustrating as a scientist to find out stuff that we've known for years, or for decades, or for millenniums. But I think the usefulness now is that we have, not precise, but we have numbers. We have data and numbers are far more convincing to move political decision makers and policy makers. If we bring this data forward, at least that's my experience in Denmark, about the importance of social isolation and connectedness and so on, it's far easier to move the politician makers and draw their attention to this field. And that brings me to what was raised over here. Is it easier to work, or is it better to work with the happiness topic or agenda or theme than, say, green or healthy? And my experience is definitely yes. I used to work within sustainability and did that for 7 years. Very important field, but basically you're walking around telling people that the world is going to end. For some reason, they don't want to listen. Imagine the study that came out yesterday was about which Canadian city was the most sustainable one. I don't think it would have gotten the same attention that the happiness ranking has done. Happiness has a tremendous convening power. I think the event here today is evidence of that. It's something everybody can relate to. It's the ultimate goal for most of us. It should be the ultimate goal for policies. So I think there is a definite leverage in the happiness agenda. I also think, this is my final point, I think I can actually do more for the sustainability agenda working with happiness than I could working with sustainability in a direct manner. I think these things that we are talking about, trying to change, motivating people to do, that will also have a tremendous effect for sustainability.
Thank you. I'm going to say a thank you, a special thank you to our panel in a minute, but I just want to do something because we've only got a few seconds left. I want the folks in the audience, in the room here today, who are intentionally, as Vicky said, involved in nurturing happiness, belonging, addressing this question of social isolation, to stand up, just so that people, the rest of you, can see how many initiatives and involvement. So just stay standing now. So there's a very interesting telephone call we had last week in preparation for today, in which I think somebody asked the question, are we going to have to do lots of priming in Vancouver? Well, here's your answer. We're bursting with abundance here, the mighty streams, and it may very well be that the advice we need to take is the advice that is offered in John's observation, that a critical factor in happiness is our ability to to collaborate, to work together. And so I have one more question. Those of you who are in the audience who would like to engage more in this topic, would you please stand? All right, that's most of you, and since you're standing, would you join me in a standing ovation to our three panelists?